Okay, so today's video I want to do something a little bit different. I want to look at CSS games, which you may not have known even existed, but yeah, you can do games in CSS now. I want to look at why, how, and then run through a game I recently made, which was a Railroad Inc. board game made in CSS. So firstly, on the why, you might say, why would you bother making a game in CSS? It must have so many limitations. It'd be so much easier to build something in JavaScript. There are so many things now people are doing in CSS, building illustrations that are very complex, sometimes with a single div. People are making these beautiful painting-like images with lots of gradients, all with CSS. People are making virtual reality scenes and all kind of unique things. It's incredible to think how far CSS has come in a short space of time. It started for styling text, and among those things are CSS game. Why not do that in JavaScript? You could just add so much more complexity and diversity, and obviously JavaScript games are a whole world of their own. It's a bit like, I keep thinking of those people who make portraits out of toast. Yeah, that's probably not what it was originally intended for, and you could probably do a lot better job with a different medium, but there's just something beautiful of trying to discover the limitations of something by trying to make something out of it that it wasn't originally intended for. Certainly if you're learning CSS, you are trying to push its limitations, CSS being a really visual format anyway, the idea of trying to see if you could try and make something that's actually playable, like a game, is just a challenge that's worth rising to. Practical reasons for doing so? All I can think of is, might be a scenario where JavaScript is disabled. So in this scenario, it would be a very fast loading thing, which doesn't require any libraries, any big complexity. Generally, it would be quite cool. But no, you shouldn't actually try and make some big, I don't know, valuable game in CSS. You'd go nuts. So how is it done? How would you go about building a game in CSS? Think about the things that you must have in a game. It must enable some sort of user input, because if the same thing happens every time, that's just an animation. You're watching a video of something. It has to be able to respond to the choices you're making, or the person who's playing. Based on the things people do, it has to serve some variation or some alternative. There has to be a feeling that the things you do have some consequence in the game. And I suppose also randomness is useful, something that means you won't play the same game every time, so there's an unexpected aspect that would add some challenge or some complexity to it. And how would you even go about something like that? CSS, as I covered in another video, it isn't really a programming language. You kind of list a bunch of static properties and those render. You can't really add any feedback for the ability to adjust things as time goes on. The only thing you can really think about is what holds state in an HTML environment without any additional JavaScript. And the answer is forms. If you think about checkboxes, it has two states. It has a checked and unchecked state, and it persists. Once you've selected that checkbox, it stays checked until unchecked. And also, that checked thing can be targeted by CSS, and you can render something to display or not display depending on whether a value is checked. And therein really lies the basis for any game or any gamified thing, is you can rely on form-based elements. Their selections means that the user can select things, we can render different things visually, and we can start to build something around that constitutes something game-like. Radio buttons have the additional benefit that if you give them a shared name tag, then they will all be aware of the state of the other one. Once you select a radio button, it can't be unselected again, it will always have a checked state. But also it means that if you check another radio, as long as it shares the same name, it will uncheck the other ones to check one. You can only check one at a time of that name group. It's one of the few scenarios in CSS where you can actually know about other elements rather than just the one that's being specifically targeted. I didn't really know this before digging into it, but there's an additional state on an input called Indeterminate. So here I've made 3 radio buttons with just a shared name. And then here on the before, I've made like a little block that sits on top just so there's something you can start. There is a status here called Indeterminate, and that just means that if it's a radio box for which no value has been set, so no radio has been checked, that means even if the one that you're specifically targeting in CSS hasn't been clicked, it will still change depending on whether another one has been selected. So here I've set that the indeterminate value is that it will have a faded red, which they currently show, but then the checked will instead have a different value. So now when I go down here and click one of the radio buttons, they immediately lose their indeterminate status because now it's been determined, which is selected, and I can then target specifically the checked one. That's really going to open up a lot of possibilities if you want to change state based on different elements on a page in CSS. So just to give a background on the game I was trying to make, Railroad Inc. is a roll and write board game. The idea is you roll dice and they give you different road and railway pieces, and then you have to, with a pen, sit and fill those in on a dry white board, and you have to try and make the roads and the railways connect to each other, and the more connections you're able to build, the more points you're able to score. I just thought for a start, you're trying to emulate a very manual physical thing. It's probably something that could be done with CSS. You're going to have to just check a bunch of boxes to fill things in, trying to complete a grid, and then that traditionally manual step in board games where you would have to tally your own score rather than all being automated would also serve well in a CSS environment versus a JS thing that would be able to cleverly accumulate everything you do. So this is basically the starting point. I've made a 7x7 grid, and then I've put some basic settings on inputs that they have a display none, the visibility is hidden, and then the before tag has a basic visible. Then further down there's a setting on the hover that will mean their opacity will show. So here if I hover on these, all of these radio buttons are showing. But if I then set an opacity 0 on the indeterminate, this means that only the ones specifically being hovered will show, because the indeterminate, which is all of them, is set to 0. So now you've got basically a whole grid of 7x7 radio boxes sitting here, but the only one that will show is the one that's being hovered in that moment. I've also set a value for the checked to have a persistent opacity and visibility. So now if I select one, that stays visible, and the ones that are indeterminate fall back to the basic input status, which is also hidden. Essentially, if you imagine there's just a big wall of lots and lots of radio buttons, all just waiting to be clicked. They're all hidden, but with an indeterminate state. When you hover and you click one, they all fall back to being hidden forever, because now the radio is set and can be unset. And then the selected one will have a visibility set so that it persists forever. And because these are hidden, there's going to be no option for you to select another radio. This will permanently be set as a radio. All you have to do then is set another bunch of radios behind it, because they're all going to have the same grid positions. They're all just sitting behind waiting to show. So as soon as you select one of this first row, they all vanish except for the one that's selected, and the next wall appears. And then because of this one sits in front, you can never set the same square twice. It means that over time, as you sort of fill up this grid with all your different squares, the only radios that appear are the ones in the vacant spaces. And that way, all you need is walls and walls of every available tile, and the person will just fill up the grid by clicking one radio for each name type until they've filled up a whole grid. So if instead of it just being a blue color like I showed there, you set it to an image, you can start to understand how the thing you're selecting is instead going to feel like a tile that fills out a grid. And what I did, rather than making hundreds and hundreds of different tiles, is just made one massive sprite image. It's a technique that's quite old. It's used for icons traditionally before, like SVGs, is you just make one big image that would load once, and then you could just make a sort of div with a fixed overlay, and then you just move the background around to fit the icon you need. So instead I'm just going to make one long tile with all the available tiles in the game, and then just set a rule that the background image be moved ever so slightly for every tile. So that basically will give you a working game. You just need to make a series of radio buttons with shared names, and as long as the CSS is right, they will display when they need to. Then when one is selected, that will persist forever. The rest will vanish, and without even having to set indexes or when to show and hide, they will all naturally just keep displaying because they're all hidden behind one another. So you in turn just click one from each of those set of radio buttons until the tiles are finished. The flaw is just that thing about randomness. Because you're sending one long sprite image, it will generally always have the same rule that in order you'll always just pick the same one, and it means that once you've learned how to get a really high score, you can basically just keep repeating because you know which tiles you're going to get in which order. So there you do need a little bit of randomness. The solution eventually was to make a serverless function, so whenever you requested that image, it would on the fly draw a new SVG and would randomize the order both of which tiles you get and the order in which they appear, and that way you suddenly get quite a dynamic, exciting game. You're going to see that's cheating to make a CSS only game, but then the whole basis is in serving up some JavaScript. But the game could work in pure CSS. That just adds a little bit more kind of fluidity to it. So technically it's a cheat, but it's a good one. So here's the finished game, which I'll put a link in the description. Basically, here's your grid. Then you've just used some additional elements to point out where the edges are. Again, there is now, you can't see them, but there's some 50 radio buttons sitting on this page. You can only see the ones that are being hovered. Then when you click, they all vanish forever, and that one persists, and you move on to your next one. And you can just generally slowly fill up the grid with what you need. Because of that, radio name persists throughout the whole document. You can also do stuff like this. Underneath, I made small tiles, which is just another selection of radio boxes, and each one vanishes whenever you click. So you can see how many remaining tiles you have, which is a nifty thing. I also made a discard, which is again just another radio button with the shared name. So if you click here, it will, rather than paint it on the screen, will just paint it here, but invisibly, so it will enable you to skip and go ahead to the next one. And also I can then use those radios to show what the next 3 tiles are looking like, because I've just got, again, a rendered strip of each one, and then when one's set, when it's no longer indeterminate, it just hides the most recent one. Anyway, that's it. I mean, there's a great deal of other CSS games out there, ones which don't use any sneaky JavaScript in the background, and some that have done much cleverer things with how you can chain different combinations of form data. But that's one avenue or one way in which you can generally achieve some element of game-like functionality within CSS. Please do have a go at the game. Try and click through to see how many connections you make. Let me know your score. That would be awesome. Or leave a comment. Let me know what you thought, or any games you've been able to build. That would be awesome. Anyway, that's all. Thanks for your time.